From New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, this is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. We start today with the markets and Kaylee Line. So Kaylee, it seems a bit mixed to me. NASDAQ is coming back a little bit. Actually, Dow and S&P, not so much.
Yeah, I think what you're really seeing here is markets across asset classes just kind of on pause, waiting for that Federal Reserve decision in about 2 hours' time. Are they going to continue to support asset prices in the way they have been? And the other thing we're seeing playing out in the market is investors really just kind of taking a moment to assess how far we've run off the March lows, where the valuations are. The S&P trading at a PE multiple of 20 at this point, and kind of weighing those fundamentals and if they should be continuing to buy risk assets. As you alluded to, the S&P is lower by about 0.4%, but you are seeing that tech outperformance once again. Within the S&P, the only sector positive on the day is technology, and the NASDAQ 100 is actually up 0.8%, set to close at yet another record high. You can take Tesla, thank it for some of those gains. Tesla is up about 7% and actually is trading above $1,000 a share for the first time. And interestingly, David, I just want to point out the dollar and yields here, because the dollar has kind of been a proxy for risk appetite, and that risk appetite is higher when it's weaker. The fact that the dollar is weaker once again signals that it's not an entirely risk-off day, but you do have yields moving lower by about 4 basis points ahead of that Fed decision, David.
Well, that's what I was going to ask about, because obviously bonds are particularly sensitive to whatever the Fed says or does as a practical matter. The yields were moving up yesterday. They seem to have come off a little bit today.
Yeah, they have. You're seeing yields moving lower, and you're seeing that curve kind of flatten out a bit after that really dramatic steepening that we had seen. And of course, this is a bond market very much going to be hanging on any words the Fed may say about possible curve control. From economists we've talked to here on Bloomberg Television, I should say. It doesn't seem like they're expecting a whole lot on that yield curve control front, but that is definitely a market waiting and watching to see if we're going to get anything there.
Okay, Kaylee, thank you so very much. That's Kaylee Lyons reporting on the markets. Well, as we've said, today is the day. Just under 2 hours from right now, we're going to get the Federal Open Market Committee latest decision, and we'll get to find out what they have to say about the economy as well. They'll give some projections for the quarter. They haven't done that since last December. To take us through that, we welcome now Lisa Cook. She's Associate Professor of Economics and International Relations at Michigan State University. Earlier, Professor Cook served on the Council of Economic Advisors for President Obama. So welcome, Professor. Great to have you with us. I guess the first thing I'm really starting with is the economic outlook. We haven't had one now in 6 months. What are we looking for?
I think we're really looking for where job growth is and might be. So as you know, there was this puzzle with respect to the unemployment rate, and the Fed has much more information than most of us do. So I think after it was declared that by the NBER recession dating committee early that the economy was in recession, I think that we are beginning to see more signs of the dimensions of that recession. So I think that's what we will be looking for, other dimensions of that recession.
I suppose a lot of people will also be looking for not just the dimensions, but also the direction of it, how fast it may bounce back. There's a lot of talk about a V recovery. People have almost given up on that some, but then we had those jobs numbers. May we get some indication whether those jobs numbers were just a blip or whether they're indicating that we may come back faster than we thought?
Well, what happened in the last recession, as you know, is that state and local governments kept shedding jobs much after the private sector had. So and if there's no intervention by Congress, that's what I would expect as well. So there's still some job losses that are going to happen. And as well, clearly we see a second wave of COVID-19 coming. As states begin to open up, it's not clear that people have directions, instructions about how to keep themselves safe and where, and the virus is still circulating. So I expect to see continued, I don't just expect to see a V, but I expect to see a swoosh. And, not as deep as the last recession, but certainly the recovery, I don't think is going to be a V. We don't have enough information, as far as I know, to be able to discern that.
The Federal Reserve has already done an awful lot in terms of monetary policy, and it's also encouraged fiscal policy to try to help this recovery. At this point, is the Fed principally really focused on making sure the markets are functioning properly, there's enough liquidity, or are they actively participating in the recovery? And if so, what could they say today to help on that?
I think they're actively participating, certainly, and I think begging and pleading for partnership with the fiscal authorities, with Congress, those who are in charge of the pocketbooks and for whom fiscal policy is really the mandate. This is just extraordinary. These efforts that the Federal Reserve has undertaken were quick, and they are still extraordinary. And the administration and Congress have got to do a lot more to take up the slack. They can't do everything. They absolutely can't do everything. Their facility for medium-sized businesses, not the smallest PPP-type businesses, that is an innovation. There are a lot of innovations, and these should be capitalized on. But they can't do everything. The Federal Reserve can't do everything. And I think it's certainly
as you say,
the burden of it becoming a prolonged swoosh or a shorter swoosh will be on Congress and the administration.
Professor, the economy clearly needs a lot of work still, but we've learned in the aftermath of the tragic killing of George Floyd, there's a lot of other work that needs to be done as well. And it's really put a spotlight on some of the great economic inequalities in this country. Is there anything the Fed can do about this? I would be very surprised if Chair Powell got through that news conference today without being asked about what the Fed might be able to do to correct some of the inequality.
I think there's several things that the Fed could do, and I think it's beginning down that path. What we heard from Janet Yellen was that the lack of lived experience, the diversity and lived experience of the economists at the Fed led to the Great Recession. And I think that there have to be more diverse voices from those with different lived experiences. And we're seeing that play out with the conversation among economists right now, that there's not this kind of diversity, and the field can't stand itself up without that kind of diversity, whether we're talking about economic policymaking or we're talking about those who are creating new knowledge in the field of economics. So I think that's one of the first ways. And then there is support of CDFIs, for example, institutions working, at least some of them, working on the racial wealth gap. I am on the board of a CDFI who has that as its mission statement. So, yes, the Federal Reserve can play a role in making sure that these are credit-worthy institutions and that they get as much support as possible.
So finally, Professor, we hear a version of this in various parts of society, certainly in corporate America, but even in the economics field, which is, well, there's a pipeline there, it's going to take some time, but we never seem to get people in decision-making positions who are people of color, African Americans, and for that matter, Hispanics as well. What needs to be done to overcome that so we're not just talking about it, we're actually doing it?
We've got to stop talking about the pipeline. The pipeline is supply. And economists know that on the other side, there's demand, and there is a racial climate that deters the best ideas from coming forward and the best people from coming forward. We can't wait on the pipeline. People need to be hired now. They are there. So we can't say that this is just a pipeline problem. I'm working on the pipeline problem. There are a lot of people working on the pipeline problem, but we can't wait another 20 years for these people to get tenure, to become advanced in their jobs wherever they are. That typically is an argument to shut down conversations of doing something immediately. And there are assistant professors and others, let's say, in academia who can be promoted or who can be invited to other institutions now. This doesn't have to wait. And there are lots of African Americans, especially African American women, who are stuck at the associate professor level. And I think that we can look around the profession to see where advances can be made, where pay gaps and promotion gaps can be made, where the climate of harassment and racial harassment and misconduct can be minimized. These are facts. We saw them in the AEA climate study that was released last year. And I really think there's a lot more that can be done just based on that survey.
Okay, thank you so much. Really good to have you with us today. It's Professor Lisa Cook of Michigan State University. And coming up at 2 o'clock this afternoon Eastern Time, we're going to have full Fed coverage in a special on Bloomberg Television. In the meantime, here on Balance of Power, we're going to have Representative French Hill of Arkansas. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Television and radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now to go to Mark Crumpton because we have Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. George Floyd's brother told a House panel today he's, quote, tired of the pain. Philanese Floyd testified before the House Judiciary Committee as lawmakers consider legislation to change policing practices in the United States. He called on them to, quote, make it stop and ensure his brother's killing leads to positive change. The Republican National Committee may move at least part of its August convention to Jacksonville, Florida. Bloomberg has learned the RNC hasn't been able to reach agreement with the city of Charlotte, North Carolina, over the scope of coronavirus safety precautions. North Carolina's Governor Roy Cooper says his state couldn't agree to demands for a full convention due to social distancing requirements. President Trump tweeted that, quote, forced the GOP to find a new location. Dr. Anthony Fauci calls the coronavirus pandemic his worst nightmare, and he warns that it is far from over. The top U.S. infectious disease specialist says the virus won't burn itself out with just public health measures. Dr. Fauci predicts that billions of doses of vaccine will be needed. China is offering workers at some large state-run companies the option of being inoculated with 2 coronavirus vaccines currently being developed. Bloomberg has learned employees intending to travel overseas for work can volunteer to be vaccinated. The shots are being developed by China National Biotech Group, or CNBG, a subsidiary of Beijing-based Sinopharm Group. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, Secretary of the Treasury Steven Mnuchin is testifying on Capitol Hill today. He said that there is a strong recovery coming, although he does say sooner or later we need to have some more legislation to support that economy. We welcome now Representative French Hill, Republican of Arkansas. So, Congressman, thank you for joining us. Give us a sense, particularly when it comes to small business, which is part of what Secretary Mnuchin's addressing. You have some experience with that, having been a community banker back in Arkansas.
Right. Well, David, thanks for having me. Yes, Steve Mnuchin's been very constructive since April 3rd in trying to make the Paycheck Protection Program the centerpiece of the administration's effort to get people back to work, keep workers connected to a job. And here in Arkansas, over 40,000 businesses and nearly $3.4 billion have helped keep people on payroll and connected to a job as Arkansas opens back up. So we passed in the House, the Senate concurred, and President Trump signed into law last week some additional flexibility for those PPP loans.
There's a fair amount, a surprising amount to some people at least, of money that's gone out already under the PPP program. Has it gone to the right places? Because we hear some reports that maybe some of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, that some of the companies have been left out. And let's put it specifically in the context of right now, today, we're seeing really some of the effects of economic inequality. What do you see back in Arkansas in terms of the banking system and its service for minorities?
Right. Well, thank you for asking that question, because we have a national leader in the community development financial institution space, the CDFI space, Darren Williams at Southern Bancorp. He and his partners have been leaders on making sure that CDFIs got their share of PPP loan access. It's always been an important part of my career, both in banking and now in Congress. I was President Bush's appointee on the CDFI advisory board back in the early 2000s. So I know the importance to CDFIs at reaching the unbanked and the nearly unbanked around the country, particularly in poorer communities.
So explain to us what we could do to really buttress CDFIs. We've heard a fair amount about them. We know some private companies have tried to support. We have a Fed meeting just today. Are there things that the Fed can do to really help the CDFI situation?
Well, look, most CDFIs have traditional shareholders, but they also have a lot of nonprofit foundation shareholders. That's how they build their capital. Some of them got in trouble during the 08-09 crisis and have just been expanding and getting their feet back under them after that terrible crisis that our economy went through a decade ago. So I would say regulatory balance, make sure they have access to capital, make sure they have training for their staff. But I see it in the credit union arena and in the banking arena. They're there to serve our low-income Americans and Americans who are trying to get a leg up in the smallest towns in the Mississippi Delta to the inner city. And so they provide a valid and very important niche in finance in our country.
Congressman, you sit on the task force, the congressional task force overseeing the implementation of the CARES Act. As we look around the country in different states or in different states of trying to come back online, if I can put it that way, are you concerned at all about some of the numbers we're seeing move up in, for example, Texas and in Arizona?
Yes, I think you're going to have different kinds of spikes with the coronavirus. Dr. Fauci is right. We don't have a vaccine. We don't have actual therapeutics. So Americans are going to have to learn to live with the virus. We know so much now, so much more than we knew back in late February and early March. I think Americans have the skills, the common sense, and the capability to live safely with the virus as we cope with it over the coming days. But it's impacting our economy, and that's why I think the economic expansion will be uneven depending on where states are reopening and hotspots that develop that we've seen even here in Arkansas, in Northwest Arkansas, and in our poultry processing towns.
As I say, you're helping oversee the implementation of the CARES Act. We heard from Secretary Mnuchin that he thinks more needs to be done. Do you agree with that, number one? And number two, if so, what and when?
Yeah, David, it's a good question. And the reason why I think every member of Congress is working and talking and collaborating is during this month of June, as the economy reopens, what are the gaps? What are the areas where Congress needs to do more to be helpful? Because as you noted in your previous speaker, the Fed has just barely gotten started. They've not put that much capital into the Main Street lending facility or the municipal lending facility, both of which could be very helpful to the economy. So this is a key period, the next 2 or 3 weeks, where we're looking for gaps. If we need to tweak the PPP program further, there's about $100 billion that has not been expended in that program. But people were to apply by June 30th, for example. Should we consider changing that? Should we consider tweaking the pandemic unemployment compensation and changing that in some way to reflect that the economy is reopening, but that reopening is uneven around the country?
Well, I'm sure you've taken a look at that. Do you have an idea about what to do? As I understand it, the special supplemental unemployment insurance is to expire July 31. There are some people who think it was so rich, it might have been right to do at the time, that it might encourage people not to go back to work. Is there a way of phasing it down or tying it to unemployment rates?
It's a really good question, David, because in the studies that were released last week, 60% of Americans receiving the pandemic unemployment extra payment of $600 a week, in addition to their state's unemployment, 60% are making more than they made when they were employed. So it could be a disincentive to work. And I think the idea that Kevin Brady has talked about of allowing people to have a portion of it as a back to work bonus, or as you say, consider phasing it down, or something that Congress needs to address as we get back together over the next few weeks and look at the gaps in what we have to do to keep the economic momentum moving.
Okay, Congressman, really appreciate your being with us. Always very helpful.
Dave.
That's Congressman French Hill, Republican of Arkansas. Coming up here, we're going to talk about Starbucks, which reported that it's not going to make quite as much money as it thought it was because of COVID-19. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It is time now for Stock of the Hour, and today is S-Bucks. We call it Starbucks, which is having a little trouble as they change their projections on top line, and Kaylee Lyons is here to explain.
Yeah, David, Starbucks is down about 4.5% today, actually on pace for its worst day in about 2 months. That fiscal third quarter outlook really pretty grim. The company said that revenue is going to drop between $3 and $3.2 billion in the quarter because of the impact of the virus. That's going to result in a loss of up to 70 cents per share. The company also gave us a read on how comparable sales are doing. Of course, that's a key metric for restaurants. They were down 43% in May in the U.S. and then down 21% in the China market, where about 99 of its stores are now operating. Overall, in the third quarter, they expect those China comps to be down between 20-25%, while in the Americas, it's going to be more like 40 to 45. Now, I will say they do expect sequentially some improvement in the fiscal fourth quarter, but still this is just underscoring the fact that this is going to be a really long slog to recovery. And as a result, you're seeing other restaurant stocks, not just Starbucks today, are lower. The S&P Super Composite Restaurant Index has about 25 members. Only 2 of them are positive on the day, and that's Domino's and Papa John's, which of course are much more catered toward delivery, David.
Yeah, Kaylee, at the same time, as I understand it, Kevin Johnson, the CEO, says they're going to try to get through this long slog a little faster by reconfiguring their stores. Tell us about that.
Yeah, they're looking to build out more pickup locations. This was an initiative that Starbucks had already started pre-COVID-19, but they're looking to accelerate it to make it happen in more like the next 18 months rather than 3 to 5 years. Basically, this is going to be stores where there aren't seating. It's not a cafe. It's just stores, pickup orders there. They said they've really had to kind of rethink their model as being a, quote, third place where consumers hang out that isn't just home or the office. But Starbucks may have to make some other changes here, too. You have to consider that, A, it's priced a little pricier than some of its competitors, like, say, Dunkin'. It doesn't have as much delivery, drive-through in its locations relative to some of its other competitors. And it's also very catered toward breakfast. And of course, consumers aren't just swinging by and picking things up on the way to the office right now. They're not getting that commuter traffic. So Starbucks may have to think some of the other ways in which it operates as well here, David.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Kaylee Lyons, for reporting on Starbucks. Coming up here, what effect did the shutdown have on the pandemic? We have Professor Solomon Hsiang here with his study that's covered several countries around the world. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for Bloomberg First Word News. And for that, we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. The chief of police in Minneapolis is promising reform following the death of George Floyd. Chief Madaria Maldonado said today the department will withdraw from police union contract negotiations. He says the contract needs to be restructured to provide more transparency and flexibility. The review would look at matters such as critical incident protocols, use of force, and disciplinary protocols. In Florida, the number of new coronavirus cases continues to climb. State health officials reported more than 67,000 cases in total, up more than 2% from a day earlier. More than 2,700 Floridians have died. The state began a phased reopening on May 4th. The European Union's chief Brexit negotiator says he wants firm signs from the UK that it will compromise to reach a free trade agreement. Michel Barnier says the UK will crash out of the European single market on January 1st unless the British government scales back opposition to key EU demands. Those include the bloc's insistence that any deal include provisions on fishing rights, fair competition, and dispute settlement. Olympic officials are still trying to figure out exactly what the 2021 Games in Tokyo will look like, but they say they are not considering canceling the event. The organizing committee says there are plans to scale back staff and the size of the ceremonies. The Summer Games were postponed until next year because of the coronavirus pandemic. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. We've all seen the dramatic effects on the economy of the shutdown in the United States, But what effect did it have actually on the pandemic? A group of experts got together and decided to look at just that question, spanning several countries around the world, including the United States. We welcome now the lead author of that study. He is Professor Solomon Hsiang. He is the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy and Director of the Global Policy Laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley. So, Professor, welcome. Please, first of all, give us a sense of the scope of this study. And just to begin here, there was a significant difference, I noticed, in the effects. That is, how many people didn't get the disease we think might have, depending on the country. China at the top of the scale, others, including the United States, further down the scale.
Yeah, those are excellent points. The scope of the study was to really look across 6 countries that had outbreaks that were very early on. And we tried to understand what policies they deployed and whether or not those policies were effective at controlling the virus. So we looked at China, South Korea, Italy, France, Iran, and the United States. And we collected data, sometimes by hand, at the national, state, and local levels, trying to figure out what policies were being deployed when, whether it was closing schools, shutting businesses. And then we used standard econometric techniques to try and figure out which ones were slowing down the virus.
And to give a sense of the magnitude here, as I read your study, at least in terms of confirmed cases, China, you think there were 37 million people who didn't get this disease that might have. On the other hand, in the United States, it's more like 4.8 million. So there's a fair range, although it's millions and millions of people we're talking about.
Yeah, and those differences, come from a few different factors. First of all, China had the disease earlier. And so basically our study finds this thing was growing exponentially, like you would expect from an epidemiological model. And so the longer you have something growing exponentially, the worse things get. Now, what China was able to do is they flattened the curve real early. And so the wedge between where they would be today if they hadn't done it and what we actually see in the world is really large. The United States got the disease a bit later. And also, we have not fully controlled it, as everyone knows. And so the difference between where we would be had we done nothing and where we are today is a bit smaller. And so the U.S. overall has effectively prevented roughly 60 million cases already. But we could, in going forward, we have to maintain a certain level of control in order to keep that number to keep caseloads down.
Well, so let's talk about that going forward. That's a great point, because right now states are opening up to varying degrees, and we're seeing, we believe, maybe some increases in cases in places like Arizona and Texas. From your study, did you get any indication of what is most effective, the different things you can do? What's most effective? What should we be considering now in the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of us come from economics, and a big question we had was figuring out which policies are effective. We realized in early March, like shutting down the economy is going to be tremendously expensive. And do these actions pass any kind of cost benefit test, right? Are we saving enough lives to merit the costs to the economy? So by looking at the different policies, figuring out which ones are working, we chip away at that problem. It gives us the power to start doing those cost benefit calculations and focus only on the policies that are most effective. What we ended up finding is that in the US context, business closures, stay-at-home orders, those things had large effects at slowing down the spread of the virus. Other things like transit restrictions had less of an effect. And there were a few things where we don't see a big benefit. And so it's possible that they're not as effective, like school closures. School closures have been tremendously costly for families. It's been tough on the kids. And so it'd be great if we could reopen the schools. And so our results don't say conclusively that school closures don't help at all, but they add to a growing body of evidence that the school closures are not the thing that matters the most.
Professor, to really go to the ultimate question, and maybe unfairly, does your study at least suggest strongly that, in fact, it was worth it to shut it down because the number of cases and therefore the number of lives lost would have been substantially higher in the United States and elsewhere?
So, the goal of our study was to say, look, we can all see these huge economic costs. We don't see the benefits because the benefits are lives that are never lost, infections that never actually occur. So we don't see those things. So the goal of the study was to try and give shape to those benefits so that society as a whole can make a judgment about whether or not these kinds of trade-offs are worth it. It's not really up to us to decide what's worth it. It's really, a question about what we're willing to do as a country to save lives.
Did you look at other countries around the world, because we see the incidence is really rising now in places like Brazil and India and things like that. Did you take a look at what those countries are doing and what maybe they should be considering to do in light of your study?
Yeah, a key goal of the study was to really go to these early countries, right? The countries that were having the disease outbreak the earliest. These were like the guinea pigs, try and figure out of all the things that they were doing, what was working, and so that knowledge could be transmitted to the other 180 countries around the world that are also struggling to contain the virus. And so I think it's been useful, and we see also a variety of patterns in sort of how countries have responded. So some countries have really shut things down so tightly that they essentially smother the disease, and they get into a regime where testing and tracing is enough to contain it. So for example, South Korea now only has about 50 cases per day. We estimate that they would have had tens of millions had they not shut things down, so had they not contained it so effectively. But there's other countries, like in our study, Iran and the United States, are both sort of, I don't know, we're like on a drip where we're not totally smothering the fire, and so it continues to smolder and it continues to grow, and basically anytime a state is opening up, we see exponential growth in cases and we'll be shutting it down. I think one way to think about what managing this is like from a health perspective is like, imagine you have a car. It doesn't have an accelerator, it just has a brake. And so every time you take your foot off the brake, the car starts accelerating exponentially, right? And so you're trying to drive this car and keep it under control using just this brake, but it's pretty hard because it moves fast the second you take your foot off. So I think that's the situation we're in, and we have to be really realistic and pragmatic about it and keep doing these types of analyses to figure out what's working and what is actually not a good use of our resources.
Yeah, it's a fascinating study. I commend it to everyone. Thank you so much. That's Professor Solomon Hsiang of the University of California, Berkeley. Meanwhile, coming up here on Balance of Power, we're going to set up the federal FOMC decision that we're going to be hearing from just a little over an hour from right now. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The OECD now is predicting that global GDP will decline 6% this year. And its executive director, he is Angel Gurria, talked actually to Bloomberg Surveillance earlier today. This is part of what he had to say.
Until we have a vaccine or a medicine, we are in danger. So obviously, the focus has to be on accelerating the research in order to get the medicine or the vaccine as soon as possible.
In the meantime, Angel Gurria, when you look at the economy, do you worry about deflationary pressures?
No, not the time to worry about inflation. Right now, you throw everything you got at the virus. You hit it, you kill it, you win the war against the virus. You throw everything in terms of finance, in terms of budget resources, in terms of health resources, because the sooner you beat the virus, the less expensive the recovery will be, and also you'll be able to cure the consequences of the virus itself in terms of unemployment and other sequels that it will leave us.
Angel Gurria, good morning from New York. I'm absolutely fascinated what Laurence Boone and others say at OECD about the amount of fiscal stimulus as compared to GDP. The variations are extraordinary. Who's getting fiscal stimulus right?
The question is that in many of these cases, what you call, government stimulus is, to a very great extent, guarantees or liquidity loans, and therefore those will not become what I would call deficit numbers, or they will not become fiscal officially until there is some kind of payback, or in some cases the facilities are built to become deficit to the extent that, for example, the companies can maintain the employment. Those are meant to become, basically taken up by the government. But in many cases, in most of the cases, these large amounts, 20, 25%, 30% of the GDP, are meant to be paid back to the banks or to the development banks, and they're only guaranteed by the government. So the numbers are not comparable in that sense. If you take what I would call the hard expenditure measures, then that changes all over the place, from very little to very large.
Anil Gurria, you are truly one of the experts in the world on your Mexico, on Latin America, and indeed the challenges of South America. The pandemic statistics from Mexico South are horrific, led by Chile, which is just simply falling apart. What does OECD think needs to be done to assist a greater South America in turning around this crisis?
Well, first of all, they need to be aware, and that means the leadership has to share these views. They have to act accordingly and within the constraints that they have. Within the constraints, this is very important, to then apply measures like confinement, social distancing, etc. The question, again, will not be solved until we have a medicine or we have a vaccine. But the problem in Latin America, Tom, and the problem in Africa, and the problem in Asia, is that it's very difficult to confine these people. They live in very close quarters, very close proximity. They have to go out every day in order to make a living. That makes it more difficult.
That was the Secretary General of the OECD, Angel Gurria, speaking earlier today to Bloomberg Surveillance. So from the globe, now we come back to the United States and that Federal Open Market Committee decision that we're going to get just at 2 o'clock this afternoon Eastern Time. To take us through it, we welcome now Ira Jersey. He is U.S. rates strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence. So Ira, welcome. Let's start actually with projections, because we had the OECD saying down 6% on GDP for the year. We're going to get some economic projections for the quarter from the Fed for the first time now in 6 months. What are we expecting?
Yeah, so I guess that there's going to be the summary of economics projections is going to show that the Fed members are kind of all over the place. I think that a lot will depend on various outlooks of depending on where some of the members are. So, for example, the South has been having a much better economy than, say, the Northeast has, just because they've had less closures and just because of the way that social distancing has been implemented in there compared to, say, the New York metropolitan area or Boston. So I think that they will be all over the place, but but the one consistent thing is it's going to be that this year is going to be very bad. So importantly, and I think that this is where policymakers and what you need to focus on in the summary of economic projections is do the preponderance of members think for 2021? Like, so how significant is any rebound going to be, and how long is it going to take for things like the unemployment rate to get down below 10% and be on a more sustainable trajectory?
What about guidance of any sort, either on rates or, for that matter, on purchases, QE and things like that? Are we expecting to get anything very concrete?
Yeah, so I think the dots will probably be pretty will be important to look at this time, and I do think that most members of the FOMC are going to have their dots near zero for at least through 2021, and then there'll be a wider dispersion of some people who are optimistic that they're going to hike maybe 3 or 4 times in 2022. That's not completely dissimilar to what you saw 10 years ago when we were coming out of the last recession, when you had a lot of members, when they first implemented the dots, where you had a lot of members who thought that they would be able to hike very quickly and normally, whereas there were others that were more skeptical of that. So look for the 2022 dots. If you have more than 1 or 2 people who think that they're going to hike in 2021, I think the market will kind of poo-poo that and say there's no way that that's really going to happen.
One of the hot topics that's come up here is yield curve control. Are we going to do it or not? Are they going to touch that with a 10-foot pole today?
So I do think that they will, actually. I think that not that they're going to implement it now, but I think during the press conference it's almost a certainty that someone will ask about yield curve control. And I think that Chair Powell in that press conference will mention that it's one of the options that they're considering. Then maybe if he's pressed on how they would do it, he'll maybe give 2 or 3 things that they've talked about in ways to implement yield curve control, and say, this has been done successfully or been done as a policy option in Japan, and even the Federal Reserve did it coming out during at World War II and through the Korean War. So I think that he'll mention it and it will be on the table. And I think, really, I don't expect it to be implemented this time, but depending on what the yield curve actually does between now and the next meeting, it's possible that they start to implement it at that meeting. That would not be out of the question. I think that might still be a little early, but I really think it depends on where does the yield curve go, given all of the Treasury supply, and does demand kind of keep up for the intermeeting period.
And finally, Ira, I'm not sure if it's in the statement, but I would be surprised if, at least in the news conference, Chair Powell is not asked about economic inequality in this country, given what's happened in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. What can the Fed do or say about that subject?
So, Chair Yellen actually had mentioned it once or twice when she was on Capitol Hill about income inequality, but it's really not in the Federal Reserve's purview. And it's really, this is something that Congress and the President really would need to work out to try and figure out how to pull back on inequality or at least lift up the bottom portions of wage earners and those with few assets, where the Fed is a blunt instrument, and I think that Chair Powell is likely to continue to say that if asked, and I wouldn't be surprised if he mentioned something about it in his opening remarks, just because he'll want to get in front of that question in anticipation of it. But really, the Fed doesn't redistribute money, right? That's not what the Fed does. That's a job for Congress, and I think that he's going to have to press on that and continue to use the Fed's traditional language in that area.
Yeah, some might say the Fed doesn't redistribute number on purpose, at least. That's not what its intention is. Thank you so much to Ira Jersey. He is a U.S. rates strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence. We want you to stay tuned to Bloomberg Television and Radio at 2 p.m. Eastern Time today, because we'll have full coverage of that FOMC decision. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, there was big news today out of the RNC, because apparently they're going to be moving their convention this summer from North Carolina down to Jacksonville, Florida. To take us through the significance of that, we welcome now Wendy Benjaminson. She's our political editor. So Wendy, welcome back. It's great to have you here. What do we read into this? The president said he wants to make sure he doesn't have to have social distancing. Is that all that's involved?
That's really it, David, and thanks for having me back on the show. The Republicans are looking to move part of their convention, sort of the hoopla part of the convention, will be moved. It looks like, they haven't announced it yet, but it looks like it's going to be Jacksonville, Florida, that has a Republican mayor, and Florida has reopened more than other states have after the coronavirus or during the coronavirus. And so it looks like the delegates will get some sort of, all the parties and all of the social parts of it, and then it will culminate in Donald Trump's renomination acceptance speech. The business part of the convention, where they actually formally nominate him, it looks like that's still going to be in Charlotte, North Carolina. But that's, 100 people in a room. So it's not the big party that we're used to seeing.
And the president could use some help in Florida, is that right?
He could use a little help in Florida. It's looking pretty tight there. We've heard that he's starting to reach out more to Cuban Americans and Venezuelan Americans who might tend to be more conservative, at least anti-socialist. And he is trying to, squeeze out every vote he can in a state that looks like it's going to be competitive again.
And finally, Georgia had a primary and it didn't go very well yesterday. What happened, and what does it tell us about November?
It tells us that November is going to be a mess, a big mess. The Georgia had a lot of problems yesterday. There were only 2 states, but we've seen this problem in Wisconsin and in Nevada and in Georgia and some other places where they're trying to, in Georgia, part of the problem was they were trying to set up new voting machines, but also they didn't get the voting machines in place, and there weren't as many poll workers because the elderly people who are usually there to take your ballot are staying home because they're afraid of the virus. And so there were these very, very long lines. And in Atlanta, black turnout was very high, probably because of the protests. And some of them had to wait in line for 4 hours to vote. And it's already pretty toasty in Georgia, so that was very unpleasant.
Yeah, exactly. Well, one of the big issues is going to be for November, how are we going to vote at all? Are we going to get to vote by mail, which is something the President of the United States doesn't particularly favor? Thank you so much to Wendy Benjamin. She's our political editor reporting from D.C. So that's going to do it for the first hour of Balance of Power, but we're going to continue for a second hour on Bloomberg Radio. We're going to be joined by Neil Bradley, Executive Vice President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We're going to talk with him about Steven Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary's statement, we need more fiscal support even though we're on a rebound. That's coming up on Balance of Power in the second hour on Bloomberg Radio. I'm David Weston. Thank you for joining us.